fully pursued. In slide 2, we examine what happens when the conditions are no and they actually move against conviction, instead of the last case where yes, everything is going well and one could proceed to continue to convict because there seems to be ample evidence, everything was done on time, and all the conditions to proceed were met. However, this tends to really not be possible when you start to read in between the lines and see all the bureaucratic steps that are necessary. And again, that was just with citizens. We didn't even start to talk about internally filed complaints, where an officer or someone working for the city actually files a complaint against a fellow officer or worker. As this work will likely just focus on citizens, for this presentation we will also just do that. In conditions where conviction may be very difficult, we will go through the different phases in which can happen for the actual case to fall apart. In the case of a citizen filing a complaint, if they do not file within the specified time frame, aka 6 months, in some cases maybe a month or a few weeks of the alleged event, while the person may be notified about the actual investigation and a partial investigation will be carried forward, honestly, it leading to conviction is quite limited. So at this point, the citizen should probably be informed that if they're filing too late, they need to be aware of what might happen in the future process ahead. And based on our investigation, most citizens don't seem to understand the process that they face. So once notified, again, the BM becomes aware of the citizen's name and the nature of the complaint. Usually, the BM will straightly not have to do anything. They will appeal and say it was not filed in time, and there will be no disciplinary action. In most cases, however, what will happen is that the BM will then go ahead and try to find legal representation through the union and or legal representation, which we will find out is actually paid for by the city. The documents, including the names of the people or the persons who have filed the complaint, may be disclosed. The BM for sure will be called to at least respond to the allegations. However, several conditions become an issue before the investigation these steps can even happen, and that's that in the time frame, proper notification must happen to all actors. Often this becomes within 10 to 30 days of the complaint, not the incident. And as well, often it seemed that chiefs could notify or decide to agree whether the charges were plausible, especially if the citizen did not sign their name and it became an internal investigation, or a fellow officer filed a complaint. The chief could decide just to throw the whole scenario out and decide that there will be no disciplinary inaction. During the investigation, all the same conditions to proceed must be upheld. All the ethical investigation standards, the protection of the officer, and often the city's support for the officer and the union. If the conviction happens and these procedures or these conditions are not actually met, any of these 4 fall apart or these 5, then the investigation cannot lead to a conviction. In no union contract was there a condition allowing for a conviction that would lead to disciplinary action if these conditions were violated, meaning there could be no official reprimand or suspension. Often, maybe it would be put onto the record, but those records were often expunged or withheld from public records. And in these cases, there often was a cost to the officer which will be taken into consideration because they will have been seen as having their personal rights violated as a government employee. So what can happen is, if there is no disciplinary action, but the BM at least has to respond to allegations, there will be a record of it, and it will be there for a few years, but eventually it will be expunged. There will likely be no disciplinary action. A BM can still appeal the ruling and have the records expunged immediately, and likely the ruling will not be upheld if there was to be a conviction at all. And worst case scenario, there's now indemnification or compensation to the officer. This means that the officer, if they were suspended for the time being during the investigation, will receive back pay. Their legal costs will be covered by the city up to a certain amount in some cases, and they may be compensated with extra furlough and possible benefits to highlight the nature that they are not guilty. So you can see there's actually a lot more room for the case to fall apart and these conditions not to be met. When you actually place the whole game together, you go ahead and you look at all the possible scenarios and you do a game theory essentially. In this case, you start to see that the process becomes highly bureaucratic, very confusing to follow, and to someone who's not within this system, who's not an officer, a union rep, this could be very daunting. Any citizen, if they were to find this out and had their rights violated, would be a little more intimidated about maybe making a complaint, realizing that they could literally have to go through the process of going to court. If there is no disciplinary action, realizing that the BM has their information, but also on the behalf of the officers, it's also important that some of these steps and procedures are in place to balance out and safeguard them, because if a complaint was filed by a citizen out of retribution, it is important to have safeguards to protect police. So it really is a game of checkers in terms of rights. I would go ahead and explain the internal filing. However, as this project at this point will not go into those details, we will go ahead and just focus on the citizen filed scenario. The last slide highlights some issues that were raised in the actual literature review and investigation of policing and union contracts related to inequitable arrests and inequitable policing use of force. And some of this involves who is actually conducting the investigation. Is this an internal unit, an external unit, which even if it's within the policing department, is its own sub-department, which is independent, or is it a mixture? And this really may link to a lot of omitted variable bias, because who conducts the investigation and who's the ultimate body of authority will really tell us how transparent this investigation is, and two, how politicized it is. It may be best if it was a mixed group conducting the actual investigation. B, the length of time affecting the cost to the city. The more that a BM can draw out or appeal a situation, or the longer or shorter the investigation is, the more intense, there are costs associated with this, and often they're costs to the cities. It's a cost to the DA, it's a cost to the police force, and there are maybe external lawyer and trial costs that the city may cover if there is no conviction. So really, there is an opportunity cost or possible threat to the city about how much this will cost to go ahead and file a complaint. If a police tases someone at a traffic stop for violating or running through the stop, is it really worth reprimanding the police officer, which could cost up into the thousands of dollars? Or do they just let it go? And these are issues really that deal with the ethics of the city. Also, there is the threat of retaliation of a fellow complainant or a fellow officer. So if a citizen files, and this information is actually shared with the BM and their team, what is to really stop that information from not being shared with others so that that person may be harassed into silence or worse? There have been cases such in Philly where officers, in retaliation for complaints, have planted evidence such as drugs or guns on people who then are arrested and investigated themselves. And often, though the charges are dropped or they're put in jail, the complaint against the officer goes away. And this is really an issue that really is at the heart of this entire matter, is if you make a complaint against someone who's in a position of authority and they have your personal information, how brave must a citizen be to go ahead forward? And how much trust does the police force have to establish within that community for someone to feel that they can go ahead and proceed with this entire process, which can be drawn out? It may just be start and finish with a simple piece of paper they fill out and leave at the police department, or it could lead to several years of torture for both the officer and or for the citizen.